Hello human geographers, we are back at it again for another lecture in our population unit. Tonight we're going to be talking about population pyramids, and that image that you see right there is a population pyramid. You're probably looking at it going, that doesn't look like a pyramid, Pileski, what are you talking about? And what this is, the term pyramid comes from the shape that most of the countries had when these displays were first created in the 1800s. As you can see, it doesn't really look like a pyramid anymore. So population profile might be a better way to describe it. But you'll always see them called population pyramids, even when they look like a house or a Christmas tree or a upside down pyramid, whatever it is, they're always going to be called pyramids. So let's kind of explain what we're looking at here. The men are on the left, women are on the right. Young people are on the bottom, old people are on the top, and those are arranged into five-year age intervals, what we will call cohorts. Population at the very bottom can be set up in total amounts, which is what you see here, or it can be percentage that group represents in a population, 1%, 0.5%, 2%, whatever it is. All right? So that's what these population pyramids are. Let's start, though, with a couple of definitions just to get that out of the way. A population pyramid, by definition, is a bar graph representing the distribution of a population by age and sex. So we can analyze a lot of different things with this. One of those things is the sex ratio. Sex ratio, by definition, is the number of males per 100 females in a population. So we standardize one of the sexes, in this case female, so it'll always be out of 100 females, and for every 100 females, how many males do we have? It could be 90 males for every 100 females. It could be 105 males for every female, or 100 females. And so that's kind of what it looks like. Now, the reality is you may also see it as a reduced ratio. For example, you may see it as 1.05 to every 1, which would then translate to 105 males for every 100 females. So just make sure that you understand that. And then our next one is age distribution, the percentage of the population within a country in each age group broken down into 5-year age intervals. All right, now that we've gotten the vocabulary terms out of the way, there are two things that I always want you guys to look for, and what I would encourage you to do is every time you see a population pyramid on one of my tests, on the AP exam, on an assignment, anything, is I would encourage you to circle these two things. So the first thing that you're always going to look for and circle are our lowest age cohort. That's going to be the 0 to 4 age range. And the youngest age cohort is determined largely by the crude birth rate and total fertility rate in a particular area. So let's go back to a previous lesson. Is crude birth rate or total fertility rate a good indicator of development? Yes, it is. So in the demographic transition model, crude birth rate is high in stages 1 and 2. It declines in stage 3, and in stages 4 and 5, it's low. So, because that forms the foundation of the pyramid, that influences the shape of the pyramid. Now, there are other factors that influence it, things like migration, war, disease, different things like that. But I always want you to look for the youngest age cohort, the bottom of the pyramid. Then, I want you to also look at what's the largest cohort. What's the largest? What's the biggest group? Now, chances are that might be the bottom of the pyramid, and that tells us some stuff. But it also might be a certain gender or age, and that tells us some stuff too. So remember, every population pyramid, I want you to look for the bottom, the youngest group, and the biggest, whatever group is the largest on the population pyramid. Bottom and biggest, that's what we're looking for. So we're going to start out by taking a look at a map. As we often do with these maps, let's do a little 4-level analysis with this. What are we looking at? Well, we're looking at population under 15 years of age. When, without any kind of information as far as when, we're going to assume that the data is fairly recent. Okay? Where, we're looking at the entire world, but at what scale are we analyzing this data at? It is at the national scale. And what type of map are we looking at? Well, it's a Corpus map. More than 5 classes on here, so that can make it a little difficult to read, but it's got a lot of information for us. What patterns do we notice? Is there a difference in terms of level of development? And what we see here is that the population under 15 is highest, largest, a big group, in areas that are less developed. All right? And they're going to represent a smaller percentage of the population in areas that tend to be more developed. So development is a pattern that we notice here. All right? And then continuing on, why do you think that might be? That's our third level analysis. And then our fourth level of analysis, okay, so what? Who cares? What are the impacts? What are the effects of this? And this is important with population pyramids. What are some of the predictions? What does this mean for a country? What does it mean for a country's future? If they have a lot of people under the age of 15, what do you think that might mean when they grow up and they start working? What does that mean when they grow up and start having kids of their own? And these are important things to consider when we're analyzing population pyramids. All right, so again, we mentioned that population pyramids are largely influenced by crude birth rate, and as a result of that, we're going to notice that each stage of the demographic transition has a unique population pyramid associated with it. This is an absolute must-know. You need to know this information. We should be able to throw you any population pyramid and you look at it and go, oh, that's stage 3 of the demographic transition model. And from there, you can then start to think about some of the other things that that might mean about a country. Oh, well, if it's stage 3, then that's going to be semi-periphery. We know that semi-periphery is going to have more factors of industrialization. And so that serves as that foundation. All right, and then we start to make connections. So that's really important. So as we go over these next few slides, once again, I want to remind you, when you look at these population pyramids, you need to look for the bottom of the pyramid. What's the biggest group on the pyramid? All right, and what I would encourage you to do is circle and label. This part's the bottom, this part's the biggest. Or if the bottom is the biggest, point that out too, because that says something about crude birth rate in an area. And that can help us with the demographic transition. All right, so this is the characteristic population pyramid for a stage 1 country. Very wide base. The biggest group is at the bottom. This indicates a very high crude birth rate, but it narrows very quickly. It bows in, what we will call a concave profile. Okay? Concave, think of it caving in. Okay? It's bowing in. Very few people reach old age, so that means that life expectancy is not very high in these areas. But what I want you to do, let's change this slide a little bit. All right? Instead of it saying pyramid for stage 1, cross out stage 1 and write pyramid for early stage 2. Because remember, how many countries are in stage 1? None. There aren't any countries in stage 1 of the demographic transition. So if you see a population pyramid that looks like this, I want you to think that country's in early stage 2. All right. Now we're going to juxtapose this with the actual stage 2 population pyramid here in just a second, but I want you to remember there are no countries in stage 1. So if you see a pyramid like this, it's early stage 2. So here is the population pyramid for stage 2, and notice this actually looks like a pyramid. Remember we said that that's where that term came from, is that's what most of the countries look like when these pyramids were first created in the 1800s. Most of the countries were in stage 2. They hadn't developed very much. The Industrial Revolution is still going on, or it hasn't diffused very wide. So still a wide base. The bottom is still the biggest, but it doesn't cave in anymore. Kind of straight sides on this. All right, it's wider and taller. People are living to be a little bit longer. That's indicative of a declining death rate that we see in stage 2. And this is a country that is growing very rapidly. The Philippines is a country that is growing very, very quickly. And their population is growing quite rapidly right now. All right. And what I would say, associate this with the global periphery. If a country has a population pyramid that looks like this is part of the periphery. And so that's important to remember because that gives us some indication of level of development. It gives us some indication of the sector of the economy that we're going to find a lot of people working in. It's going to help us get a better idea about this country. All right, so stage 3. So notice now that it doesn't really look like a pyramid anymore. Okay, we have kind of a domed shape. It's starting to bow out. Okay, what we will call convex. And so more and more people are going to be a little bit older. The youngest group is not definitively the largest. We see several groups that are relatively large. All right, so we're having proportionately fewer births. We're not having nearly as many kids as we had in stage 2 because remember in stage 3 of the DTM, the death rate is declining. Yes, people are living longer lives, but also we're not having as many kids. Birth rate starts to decline too. And this is why we are more likely to call these population profiles because most countries don't have pyramids anymore. Most countries are now into the stage 3 part of the demographic transition. A big chunk of the world's population live in semi-periphery countries. So these pyramids represent the semi-periphery. All right, and take a look at what country we're looking at. We're looking at India, one of our BRIC countries, a characteristic example of the semi-periphery. And so we're starting to see they don't really look like pyramids anymore. And I would say probably within our lifetime, there's not going to be any more pyramids. They're all going to kind of look like this, or one of the next couple that we look at. So the population pyramid for stage 4, the bottom is definitively not the largest. Now we've got a big group in the working ages. We've got a large workforce. And later in this lecture, we're going to talk about dependency ratio and how we're going to have a lot of workers to support the young and the old. All right. One of our textbooks actually calls this kind of a beehive shape. All right. Narrow at the top, narrow at the bottom, and wide in the middle. All right. And so that's important because by stage 4, we're seeing that the birth rate is low, death rate is low, so a lot of people are living to much older ages, and they have distinctly started to have fewer kids. And that started to show on here. And so this is going to be an example of our core. This is the global core. All right. And if we take a look at the country that we're using, it's Australia. Australia is a good example of this. Now, stage 5. Remember that stage 5 isn't an official part of the demographic transition model, but it is appropriate to label countries as part of stage 5, as we did when we talked about the demographic transition. So is there a characteristic population pyramid for these stage 5 countries? There absolutely is. The bottom is noticeably smaller. That means that they're having very few kids. And the top has gotten a lot bigger. A lot of people are living into that elderly age. And we're starting to have fewer and fewer workers. So this starts to become a concern for countries that are in this 5th stage, is how are we going to have enough workers to support the old and the young? And so let's use Japan as an example, all right, because that's what the population pyramid we're looking at here is. This is for Japan. Japan's population peaked at about 127 million. And it's predicted that by mid-century, by 2050, Japan's population will be about 100 million, meaning that they're going to lose about 20% of their population. And Japan tends to discourage immigration. So how is that going to impact the workforce in Japan? How is that going to impact demographics, the population, the number of kids, how we're going to support the elderly, all these different types of things? And so these are all questions, and not even questions that we necessarily have answers to, but important questions that might come from these population pyramids. All right, so this slide just summarizes what's happening in each of the stages. Again, notice that that stage 1 population pyramid is the concave, it's caving in. But again, how many countries are in stage 1? 0, none of them. So let's change that to early stage 2. So we've got early stage 2, we've got stage 2, and then stages 3 and 4, that is that convex profile. They're flexing out, they're blowing up, all right? And so that base is contracting. Notice that the bottom by stage 4 is not the largest group. And that's important to know. Now, once again, we could connect all of these back to the demographic transition model. So this is an image that you guys have seen before. Again, I would put a star next to this. This is a great review tool. Really, that's what I want you guys to know is like on this slide, just write great review tool. Because you never know when they're going to throw a population FRQ at you on the AP exam, and there's a lot on this slide that we could use. There's demographic transition model, there's population pyramids. Obviously, we could lump in the epidemiological transition model that we talked about last lecture. So there's a lot going on this slide and a lot of good explanation and examples. And all I did is I attached the population pyramids for the countries that we looked at down at the bottom. So stage 1, which we really know is early stage 2, that's the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Then you've got the Philippines, then India in stage 3, Australia in stage 4, and Japan in stage 5. And notice how those population pyramids are a little bit different from one another. That is something that you will absolutely have to do on the AP exam and on my tests. So let's make sure that we're ready for that. All right. Now that we understand the basics of it, let's get to the level 4 of our analysis. Okay, so what? What's the impact of this? And so for countries that are growing rapidly, think stage 2. That's when we see the most rapid population growth. That's when the bottom is the biggest. Here are some of the things that a country that is growing rapidly, like the Philippines, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, might have to think about. They might need more services for children, things like schools and daycare. Because there are fewer old people, they don't need to spend as much money on it. They don't need to build a bunch of retirement homes and geriatric care facilities. They don't need to do that because there's not that many old people to use them. Right? In addition, that in these areas that have rapid growth, we're also going to see a lot of people move to the cities to find work. We're going to talk about this in our migration unit. We're going to talk about this in our urbanization unit. But for right now, just know that if a country is growing very, very rapidly, people might be moving to the cities to try and find work, typically from rural areas. So we see rural to urban migration. And it's important to note that the countries that have the fastest growing populations generally have the fastest growing cities as well. So we're seeing rapid urbanization in these countries that also have rapid population growth. So changing the scale a little bit on that point. We tend to see, because so many people are moving to the cities, there's quickly constructed buildings to house these workers. This is a vocabulary term we'll introduce in our very last unit of the year on urbanization, but the term that we will use is squatter settlements. And they go by different terms depending on where in the world you are. Slums is probably the most common term, but favelas, barrios, shanty towns, they go by different names, but the vocabulary term we use in AP Human Geography is squatter settlements. These hastily constructed buildings so that people just have a place to live, all right? And many of these areas lack infrastructure. They lack things like access to clean water, safe electricity, sanitation. And these are all things that have a direct impact on the quality of life, the ability of people to find work, all these different types of things. And then in addition to people moving to the cities, people are also leave the country. And this is something that we'll talk about in our next chapter with the migration transition model. Essentially, there's characteristic types of movement that people have based on the stage in the demographic transition. So if a country is growing very, very quickly, there's probably not enough jobs unless the economy is growing at an equal pace. And so if there's not enough jobs, people are going to leave. People are going to go someplace else. And where are they going to go? They're going to places where the population is not growing as quickly. So those areas that have high population growth, they're looking at the areas like Europe, like North America, Japan, Australia, where they aren't growing very quickly and they need workers. And so that's a trend that we tend to see. Now, in addition to this, we can talk about a couple of vocabulary terms that aren't on our vocab list but should be important to know because we might see questions about them and things like that. So I want to make sure that we've for sure covered that. So this is looking at a population pyramid for us here in the United States. All right, and we're going to talk about baby booms. A baby boom is when there is a spike in the birth rate. And for us here in the United States, we have an entire generation called the baby boomers. People who were born in the United States after World War II, up to about 1960 or the early 1960s. All right? And oftentimes this will happen during periods of good economic times and when a family can afford this. But here in the United States, it happened. All of these servicemen were coming back from the war, and they had a lot of babies. All right. After that, notice that dip in. Okay, so move down from that big spike in like the working age, the 35, 45 age range. Okay, and then move down. Notice that it dips in there. All right, that is known as a baby bust when fewer babies are born. Now, at that point, the baby boomers are kids, they're teenagers. By the time they get into their 20s and 30s and they start having their own kids, once they reach childbearing age, there is another boom. And because it is a product of an earlier boom, we call it an echo boom. That's what you see down there in that 15, 20, 25 age range. All right, that second boom, that's the echo boom. And so that's going to be, to a certain extent, some of our millennials, maybe some Gen Xers. All right, they're a product of baby boomers having their own kids. So when the baby boom had another boom, we call it an echo boom. And this is something that we see in areas of high growth. And so one thing that we could talk about, this is an article for those of you interested called If Africa Banks Its Demographic Dividend, because Africa is growing very, very quickly right now. Okay? And so they're looking how can they use all of those workers to their advantage to improve their levels of development. And so that's what this article is about. Now, what about some of the countries that are growing a little more slowly? This is going to be maybe not so much your stage 3 countries, but starting to get into your stage 4 and certainly your stage 5 countries. So when you have a much older population, you need to make sure that you have services that are catered towards them. And so developing things like retirement programs, an example like we have here in the United States is Social Security, medical programs that are geared towards older individuals. What we have is called Medicare here in the United States. These are examples that can help elderly individuals. In addition, in countries that have slow growth generally have fewer young people, so less money is going to be spent on them. They don't need to keep building schools and daycares and things that cater to young people. Instead, they need to be focusing on building services for the elderly. Right? Now, in addition, and this is a very real concern for many countries that are growing slowly, is a shortage of workers. They could have a shortage of workers in the future. And we're going to talk about dependency ratio here in just a moment. But essentially, there's a couple ways to combat this. Either you have more kids, you offer incentives to have more kids, or you bring in people from other countries who can work in your workforce. And so we already mentioned that these migrants in these fast-growing countries often will leave and go to a country that isn't growing as quickly, and there'll be workers there. Right? And typically they go there because, one, there's jobs available, and the wages tend to be higher than they would find back in their home country. Right? And there's also political impacts of a slower growing population, because you might see a change in the voting patterns. You might see a change in the representation of a population if they have a large elderly population. All right, so we mentioned dependency ratio a couple of times in this lecture, so let's clarify what we mean by that. It's one of our vocabulary terms. It is the number of people under the age of 15 and over the age of 64, so people who are too young, too old, compared to the number of people active in the labor force. So it's basically a ratio of workers to non-workers, what we will call dependents. So it's a dependency ratio, right? And it's important to note that this is just an estimate. There are many people who are working age who don't, and there are many people who are younger than 15 or older than 64 who do work. So it's an estimate, all right? And we can calculate them, we can isolate them into a youth dependency ratio, we can isolate them into an elderly dependency ratio, or we can just look at the overall. And that's what we're going to look at, is the overall dependency ratio. All right? So in order to calculate this, we add up the percentage of people who are too young to the percentage of people who are too old, and then we divide it by the percentage of people who are working age. And that gives us the number of dependents that each worker has to support. All right, so let's apply this. Germany, which is in stage 5, has 12% of people who are too young, 22% who are too old. Notice the high elderly percentage. So that's 34% of people who can't work. 66% who can. 34 divided by 66 is roughly 0.52. So that means that for every one worker, they have about 0.5 dependents who are depending on them, essentially, all right, who need to be supported. So turn that into real people numbers. Basically what we're talking about is for every one person who can't work, there are 2 workers to help support them. All right. Now let's look at a different country, Sudan. Sudan is probably in stage 2 of the demographic transition. Take a look at the numbers. 36% who are too young to work, under the age of 15. And then we have 3% who are too old, shorter life expectancies. These are things that we should start to notice. And then we have 60% who are workers. Now, while 0.52 and 0.66 don't seem that far apart, it's a lot closer to one worker having to support one dependent. And that can put some stress, and especially when you start talking about really young people. Now, in the future, this might mean that you have a lot of workers to support those dependents. But for right now, that can put a lot of strain on the economy, on the working class, on whatever group is dependent, whether it's youth or elderly. So make sure that you're able to calculate this, because I do think that this is something that you might be asked to do on the AP exam. In addition to this, there's some outside influences that can impact a population pyramid. So for example, migration is one of these things. All right? The example that you see here is the United Arab Emirates, which has a huge guest worker population. Now most of these guest workers, as you can probably see looking at this population pyramid, tend to be males. Now, we might see a similar population pyramid in mining towns or military bases, something that tends to be more, have a lot more males employed in it, all right? But if we change the scale, for example, if a city has a university that has a really strong nursing program, and that's a profession that in the United States is approximately 90% women, it might create a similar gender imbalance as more women move to that city to attend that program. So we can change the scale on this as well. Famines. Famines can cause a clear drop in the population, especially amongst the very young, and we should add the very old. And this applies to disease as well. All right, we're going to take a look at it on the next slide, an example of Botswana that has been decimated by AIDS. And the greater number of people affected by it are the youth, people very young, and the elderly. And finally, war. This is looking at Russia. Now notice the very top, how there's significantly fewer men than women. This is a product of World War II. All the men that died during the war, we can still see that represented in their population pyramid. And so this is what we were talking about. This is looking at Botswana and their projected population in 2020. All right. The darker blue, that is their projected population. The lighter blue, those are people that could be there but died because of AIDS. And so one of the textbooks actually calls these population chimneys because so many people die from this. It almost looks like it's in population decline when it really isn't. It's actually more of like a late stage 2, early stage 3 country. But you can't tell because of the impact that AIDS has had. And so there's an article here talking about the end of the population pyramid because, again, very soon there aren't really going to be any countries that are pyramids. And so should we start calling them population profiles to more accurately reflect the diversity and shapes that we might see? All right, so let's go ahead and put this to the test. Let's do a little quiz. I'm going to show you a population pyramid. I'll tell you what country it's from. You tell me what stage of the demographic transition model this country is a part of just based on its population pyramid. So we'll start out here with Mexico. What do you think with Mexico? There's Dora. She's thinking. What did you think? Put a guess down. Doesn't matter if you get it right or wrong. We'll talk about it in class. Put a guess down. Next one, Belgium. Belgium. What stage do you think Belgium is in? Notice the biggest. Notice the bottom. What does that tell you? Put a guess down. Something. Afghanistan. What stage of the demographic transition model? Don't let this trip you up. And finally, Germany. What stage of the demographic transition model do you think Germany is in? Put a guess down. Bring those answers to class. We'll discuss them. Have a good night.